Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we'll be discussing the Manchurian crisis of 1931 and the League of Nations response to this. Okay, so let's go back to the origins of the crisis, which can be traced back to the Japan situation in the 1930s, which is right after the Great Depression of 1929, which impacted Japan a lot because it greatly reduced its silk exports because of this, which is one of Japan's biggest exports, because they traded them mostly with the USA, which closed off its own economy, so Japan had no one else to export all this silk to. Also, Japan greatly reduced its agricultural outputs because of the Great Depression, because of its very densely populated land. It didn't really have that much land left for agriculture, and it was hit with a series of droughts and famines, and although all the population really greatly suffered, the rural population was the one that was hit the hardest. So the ones living outside of the cities, so the farmers basically. This leads to more support for the military and nationalists because there was widespread discontent. Many people see themselves supporting the more extremist groups. The government was also unable to adequately handle the crisis that was at hand. So people were more and more unhappy with the situation in Japan. So as I said, this leads to the rise of militarism and nationalism for Japan, because there was already long-standing resentment in Japan from Japanese nationalists for the West. The Japanese people, in fact, believed that the Great Depression had hit them so hardly because of how close to the West they had become. So this is in two aspects. So very close economically, in the sense that they traded so much with the West, and mainly the USA, that obviously since they were so connected to them, the Great Depression had the knock-on effect to them so quickly and so strongly as well. And also because of Japanese values traditional values had kind of been lost and replaced with those of the West. Out of all the countries in Asia, Japan was the one that was the closest to West in terms of values, like drinking, partying, women were dressing more revealing, which a lot of Japanese nationalists and traditional people did not like. And also in 1922, with the Washington Naval Agreement, it set the ratio of basically heavily armed naval ships to 5 to 5 to 3 for USA, UK, and Japan respectively. So Japan was given the lesser ratio, which they didn't believe was fair, which also led to more resentment for the West. And also the racial equality clause in the League of Nations Covenant, which Japan had tried to introduce, was rejected by the USA and the UK, which didn't see racial equality as something that they believed in, which the Japanese didn't think was fair, and again led to more resentment. The Japanese nationalists wanted to go back to the traditional values of Imperial Japan and go away from the West. And part of this was part of the solution they saw to the Great Depression was to get more space and resources through the building of an empire in the Far East. So this is where Manchuria comes in. So what was Manchuria? Manchuria was a province of China. It has a lot of agricultural land, it's spacious, it's rich in iron, coal, and rice plantations. So as you see, this is Manchuria, and this is Japan over here, and they're very close. Japan already had control over Korea, and it bordered China, and Manchuria borders China over here, the USSR up here, Mongolia over here, and Korea over here, which was Japanese owned at the time. The Japanese Kwantung Army, which is basically the Japanese Imperial Army, had the rights to use the railways in Manchuria. Already had the rights to use the railways in Manchuria, as the outcomes of the Sino-Japanese and the Russo-Japanese wars of their early 1900s. So, the Mukden Incident, which is when the Manchurian crisis begins. So, on the 18th of September of 1931, the Japanese Kwantung officers in Manchuria decide to stage an explosion attack on a portion of the railway just outside Mukden, which was a city in around southern Manchuria. And they blamed this explosion on the Chinese people. So in attack, they used this as an excuse to occupy the whole town of Mukden and all of southern Manchuria to guarantee order, because they believed that they said that the Chinese army was a threat to them, when in reality they had staged the attack themselves as an excuse to expand. It's very important to know that this was almost done. The military had almost taken control of the government in Japan already, and the real government didn't really have much of a say, as I said before, with the rise of militarism in Japan. So this was taken independently of the government. The government didn't agree to this. The Japanese keep gaining more and more territory, and by March of 1932, they control all of Manchuria and rename it the Autonomous Japanese Puppet Province of Manchukuo. So it's autonomous, but it's basically puppet to the Japanese government. So how did the Chinese and the Japanese respond to this? So China appeals to the League of Nations. As soon as Japan invades all of southern Manchuria, they ask the China, which is part of the League of Nations, ask it for help. They call in Article 11 of the League of Nations, which is that of collective security. An attack on one member of the League of Nations is an attack on all. So China says, Japan attacks me. I'm a member of the League of Nations. I need help. And I deserve help. It's part of the League Covenant. They requested that the event should be investigated by the League of Nations. However, the Japanese representatives of the at the League of Nations assure that there had been no declaration of war, so Japan hadn't really offended anything, and they had no ambitions in the region. They were just protecting themselves from the Chinese attack. They didn't really want anything in the region. The reality was that the Tokyo government barely had any control over the Kwantung army and military, the one carrying out all this expansion in Manchuria, which kept making gains in Manchuria, basically regardless of what the Tokyo government was saying. So how does the League respond to this? They respond with the Lytton Commission. So they send Lord Lytton to Manchuria to assess the situation. The Lytton Commission report, which was completed in September 1932, which was over a year after the League had, which was a year after the Mukden Incident had occurred, they produced a very balanced and very detailed report, but even though it was very balanced, they still stated quite clearly that Japanese had seized Chinese land illegitimately and had to withdraw immediately back into the railway zone where they were allowed to be. They had to get out of all the area that they had expanded illegally into. And China and Japan should also negotiate a non-aggression pact and a trade agreement, per the Lytton report. So, how did the League react to the Lytton report? In 1933, it was accepted by all League Assembly members, except for Japan, for obvious reasons, which refuses to leave Manchuria. And they vetoed the decision, and they leave the League of Nations disgusted. The only strong League action, only a very strong League action would make the Japanese leave Manchuria at this point. However, its main members and naval powers, so basically the UK and the USA, which was not even a part of the League of Nations, are not prepared to take firm action against Japan. Britain itself is struggling greatly with the Great Depression, and it's really not willing to get involved in issues that seem so far away in Japan. Also, the USA was not in the League of Nations, so it was not really bound to do anything anyway. And the League is paralyzed. It does not set any military or economic sanctions, basically at all. It does nothing in response to Japan's actions and China's appeals for help. And this is important because Britain and the USA had refused to do anything, the only two naval powers that were able to do anything against Japan. So, what is the consequence of the crisis on Japan? So, Japan had strengthened its position in the Far East and Pacific. Because it gained all that large area of Manchuria, it was able to gain all of its precious resources, and this helped it escape the crisis. And also, it also led it to border with many more countries, with, like, for example, greater border with China and the USSR, which obviously made it more strong in the Pacific, and it guaranteed access to Manchurian resources. It was also a win for nationalist and militaristic Japan, which allows the military and national extremism in Japan to gain more and more power and more support by the people. And it also leaves the League of Nations, which means now it is free to make even more gains all throughout the Pacific and the Asian Pacific without any restrictions or anyone to say anything. So obviously there were consequences for the Manchurian crisis on the League of Nations. So firstly, and almost most important, the League looked extremely weak because it was unable to stand firm against obvious aggression from Japan. They also it showed that the League work was very slow because the Lytton report was considered 18 months after the Japanese had already invaded Manchuria. It also showed the League members were undedicated because, for example, Britain and even League member allies like USA were simply unwilling to enforce sanctions. It also showed how the League of Nations was Eurocentric because they were mostly concerned with matters in Europe. For example, Britain wasn't willing to enforce any sanctions or spend any time or really any money on sanction in Japan because it seemed like these issues were not relevant to them because they were so far away, all the way in the Asian Pacific. And also, very importantly, it showed fascist dictators like Hitler and Mussolini that the League of Nations was very, very weak. And this is very important because this is a significant factor, historians believe, that prompted Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia that I'll be talking about in my next video. And also, it contributed to the failure of the simultaneous disarmament conference that was going on at the same time as the Manchurian crisis. Lastly, Manchuria was an obvious failure for the League of Nations, but there are some ways we can argue that that the League of Nations was really unable to handle the crisis itself. So, it was the greater scale of aggression that the League of Nations had ever seen before. It was also called by many historians the first major crisis of the League. So obviously the League of Nations wasn't able to deal with such a big crisis. It wasn't really fair to the League of Nations to say it wasn't really fair to blame the League of Nations for not being able to deal with such a large, aggressive and militaristic country. And it's also right after the Great Depression, so countries were unwilling to cooperate as they had sort of been in the 1920s. And also, the situation was in the Far East, so obviously the main powers of the League of Nations, the European powers, would have been unwilling to cooperate. So that is all. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and if you have any ideas for any videos, please let me know as well. Thank you.